So here we are again. Last year I made my second longest video on the channel of all time about the remake of my favorite game ever, Silent Hill 2. While I think that I went into detail about what made the game such a fantastic remake of a game that I consider to be the most meaningful thing in my meaningless life, I do wonder if I went into enough detail about my nostalgia with the original game and what made the remake such an emotionally confusing and surreal experience. For as emotionally testing as Silent Hill 2 Remake was to me as such a long-standing fan, it was the first new game in my favorite franchise ever in 12 years. While it was only a remake, the structure, atmosphere, mechanical spirits, and vibes were exactly what I wanted out of not only a remake of Silent Hill 2, but a new Silent Hill game in general. Not only did it give me confidence in the franchise from here on out, because they more or less had the perfect template to make a Silent Hill game in the ideal modern lens. In a comparative example, the return of Resident Evil in a classic sense was Resident Evil 7. Now, even though I hold some, let's just say, mixed opinions about that game, it did hold enough of the design templates of the classic entries in the series. But, in my opinion, so many of those aspects were streamlined in a way that they felt simply obligated to be there to ensure that this was indeed a return to survival horror. Now, despite my mixed feelings towards Resident Evil 7, the fact that Capcom had attempted such an earnest effort at all to bring Resident Evil back to its roots had instilled high hopes that the next game would be a new entry that felt more like the classic games. And in a timeline sense, that's quite literally what happened. Resident Evil 2 Remake was the most excited for a video game I had been in probably 10 or more years. It was a game that I had dreamed about ever since I played the original Resident Evil Remake on the GameCube when I was younger. After bare minimum 10 years of hoping and crushing anticipation, Resident Evil 2 Remake was almost literally exactly what I had always hoped it would be. It was the perfect modern recreation of what the original game was, updated and refined with a modern angle, despite its lack of cameras being fixed. It was genuinely scary at points, it retained its puzzle box level design and item management in a way that caused so many instances of me looking at the map, scratching my head and trying to figure out a path of least resistance given my inventory during each frantic bombardment to the next save point. And on top of all of that, it did the now standard video game remake tactic of making the old new again. New areas, new story beats, new stuff. It was everything that I could have ever wanted out of a classic Resident Evil game, but simply in the modern era. And then Village came out and fucked everything. And going back to Silent Hill, that was what the Silent Hill 2 remake was. While it didn't have the same item management mechanics, making the treks between save points a little bit less strenuous, that was how the game always was. The core structure of the original game, however, was there. It had been updated and modernized a bit, but everything that you could qualify as survival horror in terms of atmosphere, mechanics, and level design was there. Silent Hill F, in contrast, however, was a known mystery. We had known so little about it, though, for nearly 3 straight years, that when we finally started to understand more about the project, it kind of felt hard to believe. Despite its drastic changes to the series and my almost inevitable hesitation towards at least some of those changes, it was going to be the first new entry in 13 fucking years. I felt confident that despite whatever new location, whatever new story, whatever new mechanics that Silent Hill F was going to have, the new games, all produced and spearheaded by lovable marshmallow Motoi Okamoto, would at least share some mechanical funnel of game design. There would be a cohesion that would tie all of these games together in at least some regards, not including these ones. And to some extent, yeah, that's kind of what happened. But F proves that not only was I pretty much wrong, but that unsurprisingly, it was pretty divisive. If it's not clear by now on my channel, I love Silent Hill, okay? I'm a Silent Hill simp. When F came out, I was hoping for a grand slam, a clear shot into the fucking sun. I wanted my wings to burn with how hot this game was. But instead, I got a game that made me ask myself, what even is a Silent Hill game at this point? But before I really get into all of that, I think I need to establish a few things and answer 3 important questions. What makes a survival horror game? What makes a Silent Hill game? And what am I okay with F changing? Survival horror as a genre has been fudged over and misrepresented over the years. What started as a very distinct genre and systems of mechanics that, as the years have gone on and more kinds of horror games have come out, has mutated into sort of becoming a blanket term for a lot of horror games. If you do a simple online search for, I don't know, the scariest survival horror games, literally the first result is a list of games that include sensible entries like Resident Evil 2, Siren, Silent Hill 2, even more recent games like Tormented Souls. But in that same list, you'll get Five Nights at Freddy's 4, The Outlast Trials, The Last of Us Part 2? Also, the simple fact that Dead Space 3 is higher on this list than Dead Space makes me want to scream into the void of space so loud that God themselves would hear me. I also want to clarify that I do understand that artistic genres, like anything, will change and potentially obfuscate over time, and I am okay with that. But I think that there needs to be at least some precedence of what classifies a game to be just a horror game, and what classifies a survival horror game. While pretty nebulous as will be my answers, I think that these keystones are and should be seen as mainstays of the survival horror genre. You got a puzzle box. I've gone into detail about this aspect in several videos on my channel, so I apologize if you have to sit through this again, but if you've not seen me talk about it, I'll ask the question to you. What is a puzzle box? Well, in terms of a survival horror game, I see it as an expansive yet tightly designed area that you have to explore, coming to several dead ends, requiring items and solving puzzles to progress further into the game. Resident Evil Remake is my go-to example, as the game mostly takes place in the mansion, and while you do have a singular path that you could take, odds are your first playthrough of the game will be beset by many minutes or potentially hours wandering around, wondering where your next objective is, where the next item that you need is, or where you need to use that next item that you found. Or maybe you've just missed a room altogether. Again, I've said this before, but a survival horror game, the way I see them at least, is essentially a spooky Metroidvania game. This part of the pillars of the genre, in my opinion, help amplify the next point, which is, you got shitty combat and tough enemies. If you are constantly having to traverse back and forth between areas of the game riddled with enemies, you want a lot of the tension to be coming from the fact that not only do these enemies have the potential to kill you from even the beginning of the game, but you want those enemies to instill a sense of dread, or at the very least, make you cautious about any pathway that you end up taking. Resident Evil tackled this by giving the zombies a sizable life pool and the player having very limited ammo, as well as an awkward and clunky aiming system. Silent Hill combated this with incredibly awkward combat that became a series mainstay for most of its life. Siren tackled this by making the game's enemies impossible to kill, but instead demanded that you avoid them as much as possible, as well as making the game basically impossible to navigate. Many games iterate on these types of ways of tackling this concept, but I think a survival horror game without combat that makes you at least consider all of your other options, you're basically just left with a survival horror without much bite. Even if your only option is to run, player disempowerment truly fuels the survival horror genre and the third tenet, which is horror. Yeah, look, no, I know this may seem a bit obvious, but I feel like I at least have to point this out. If the game isn't at least trying to creep you out, send shivers down your timbers, or outright scare you, then what you've got at worst is a weird Metroidvania, and at best a knockoff Souls-like. I also do want to clarify that the game doesn't have to scare me for this point to still stand. Luigi's fucking Mansion is a survival horror game by my metrics, okay? Those are at least some of the most important factors into making a survival horror game. You don't need fixed cameras, you don't need item management or anything else extraneous, sort of in the same way that you don't need a Souls-like game to be grim and dark or even necessarily that difficult to qualify it as such. But I think that the most important question here is, does Silent Hill F even feel like a Silent Hill game? Silent Hill F, right from the start, was set to be a divisive game. It was the first game to not have any ties to the titular town, and look, I know that you spend a lot of time in 3, not in Silent Hill, and I know that 4, for the most part, only has occasional visits to what might even be considered the town at all, which meant that theoretically, the team basically had free reign from there to do whatever they wanted. It was also being written by Ryukishi07, which is someone that I had no real history with, but thankfully, they not only had a loyal fanbase, but when they found out about his involvement, a lot of people rejoiced. Claiming him to be as much of a perfect fit for the franchise as a hole in the Amigara fault. As more information came out about the game, it became clear that not only was the game going to be more action-focused, but it was going to have a revamped combat system, a completely new type of Otherworld, and a completely fresh and unique story that was clearly focusing on the gender inequalities of 1960s Japan. And I cannot emphasize how radically different most of, if not all of these things are to the franchise, and as a long-standing fan, despite my almost inevitable excitement for a brand new Silent Hill game, I couldn't help but feel hesitant about letting myself get fully on board the hype train. Well, now the game is out, I've beaten it 3 times, and I've gotten the true ending. What did I think? Shit's weird, dude. But first, let me just talk about the things that I am actually totally okay with the team taking liberties with and changing. Just because I'm a grumpy old fuck of the series doesn't mean that I'm not okay with new ideas and new things to the franchise. I was and still am completely fine with the game not taking place in the actual town of Silent Hill. Since Silent Hill 4, I always felt that the town of Silent Hill was essentially a surrogate for the evil power that had overtaken it to begin with, and the idea that there could be other places that had succumbed to said evil was a concept that not only I was on board with, but it gave the series infinite possibilities from here on out. As long as the game retained its quality maze-like level design and made the exploration of the town of Ebisugaoka, its otherworld, and its inevitable interior locations feel like exploring and solving a puzzle box, then the location that game takes place in is relatively of little consequence. Silent Hill 2 Remake proved that Konami at the very least had a template of the classic design built up and modernized that still felt like the old games to enough extent. I was okay with the revamp to the game's combat system. If you ask me, making the combat mechanically more interesting, or at the very least, subjectively improved in a mechanical sense, is a good thing. The franchise, ever since its very beginning, has always had people saying that the games were good despite their combat system. And if you're going to make a new game in the year of our Lord 2025, you should at least attempt to make something of a respectable quality. And honestly, the fact that it got called a Souls-like by journalists only fueled my interest more, because having a survival horror Souls-like is honestly where the genre could thrive in. Silent Hill 4 has been one of my favorites in the franchise for years at this point, and that game has always been the black sheep of the series, mostly due to its reinvention of the series combat. I'm okay with games trying something that feel better to play as long as it still retains a clunky, but also, and most importantly, the awkward feeling that trying to fight for your life that has always fueled these games. I was okay with the premise of the game's narrative, because Silent Hill 3 is the only game in the series to have a female protagonist, and only sort of half commits to the gender theme that it has. Instead, it frustratingly goes both ways with that narrative, and having it focus on the cult of the first game.
I am Claudia.
So what?
Having an entire game with the focus of gender inequality from a female perspective felt like a brilliant move, and could be the one that finally fulfilled the promise that initially started with Silent Hill 3. The inherent horror that could come with the personal story about being a woman set in Silent Hill could, on its own, be enough to be one of the most emotional and terrifying the series has ever manufactured. Coupling all of that with the fact that it was going to be taking place in 1960s in Japan meant that F could go really hard with its gender-focused horror. It could go to some deeply uncomfortable places pretty easily, and with the Silent Hill flavor of deeply symbolic creature designs and esoteric world building. As long as F maintained the series' famously oblique storytelling and its wonderfully cryptic symbolism, then there would be nothing for me to worry about. I may love the Silent Hill games deeply, but I am okay with them taking chances and offering new ideas. Even if I'm not the biggest fan of the more modern entries of Resident Evil, I do appreciate what they've done to the franchise, and those big stupid as fuck games gave way to the modern remakes of older entries which are much more my jam. And now with Silent Hill apparently jumping on board this remake train with the now announced remake of Silent Hill 1, even if newer entries aren't entirely to my liking, I still have a fresh take on the older systems that brought me this franchise that I love in the first place. So honestly, I still get to have my cake. I just have to decide whether or not I want to eat it too. With all of these caveats out of the way, of what I was okay with F doing, what were my initial impressions of F? Not that great. Silent Hill F, all at once, is tense, disturbing, at times upsetting, and viscerally satisfying, but the worst part about this fact, and this is going to sound silly, is that there is so much here that is unbelievably high quality. The game is astoundingly beautiful, from an artistic direction as well as a systems one. It's been said before many times leading up to this game's release, but an Unreal 5 game running this well is basically an anomaly. This game is a living cryptid. Oh, I wrote that. Oops. It's a real-life video game cryptid that over 1 million people played. Its visual flair is consistently stunning, at points jaw-dropping, and the game at almost no point feels like it has to hide how good it looks. The music. Oh my god, the music. One of the series' best, hands down, not even close. This time around, it's being written and produced by not only just series mainstay Akira Yamaoka, but also contributed by, I'm going to butcher these names, Kensugi Inagi, who is known for a lot of composition work on the Dynasty Warriors series, among other things, with additional help from Dai and Xaki, who helped Ryukishi 07 with his When They Cry series. F, right from the get-go, also presents an incredibly interesting narrative, with the main character Hinako being thrust right into the thick of the power of the town after her relationship and her circle of friends are established. Hinako's journal is also a really great establishment of every main player in this game's story, with well fleshed out entries for each character. The game's combat is also quite possibly the best combat I have ever seen in any survival horror game. While it is Souls-like to at least some extent, the two combat types, Souls-likes and Silent Hill Fs, are still pretty different, but both rely on timing-paced precision, and as well, they are both perfectly tense, and this type of melee combat works perfectly in a horror game. While it's not intentionally clunky like the old games, which could instill a fear or at least a mild panic when your character doesn't hit the thing that you were hoping for, this new combat style instead feels like it's there to make you clench and hold your breath, making each encounter life-threatening, which is what you want out of a survival horror game. Despite it being much more fluid, it almost assuredly more fun and substantially more satisfying than older combat systems. It never feels unfit for a survival horror game. Now, in relation to the combat system, let me talk about the one thing regarding it that leads me to be slightly less than worried about, but more than concerned, and that is the offering system. Now, in a vacuum, it's pretty cool. You will find items that you can offer at this game's save points to earn mechanical numerical bonuses that you can use to get upgrades for your character. You can upgrade your health, your stamina, and your focus meter, which acts as a heavy attack in the game. You can also use this system to earn random pulls from an ability pool that you can use to craft little mini builds that can give you a significant advantage in combat and the rest of the game. My little gripe with this system is the fact that this is the first instance of the game not feeling like a Silent Hill game. Is it cool? Absolutely. And I love the fact that you can offer up some specific healing items for reward as well, giving the player a wonderful push and pull system within itself. The idea that you could potentially hinder your future progress by giving up enough of your healing items that make future parts of the game more difficult at the promise of a more powerful endgame is awesome. And I hate even asking this question, but does that belong in a Silent Hill game? And I open with this specifically because if you ask me, this system being utilized as a new idea and an experiment in Silent Hill F specifically, totally fine. It's nothing that detrimental to the game as a survival horror game, but it does make it feel so homogenized with many of Silent Hill's contemporaries in a way that Silent Hill F is already starting to do so. It would fit a more action-oriented game perfectly fine. Even a more action-oriented survival horror game like Resident Evil. But if my opening concern is a system that, in the end, I am okay with, you may be asking yourself, what's the problem? Kind of a lot. Let me get my biggest grievances out of the way first, and one of them in particular is the game's seemingly inability to even attempt to be a puzzle box. F is as linear as a game masquerading as a survival horror game could possibly be. The tight, twisty corridors of Ebisugoku help give the impression of a maze or of a more intricately designed world because there are so many short bursts of turns that it feels more convoluted than it really is. Silent Hill 1 through 3 have you opening the map much less often in the town specifically, in my experience, because of its more direct and straightforward town design. It's a bunch of straight lines that are easily broken up into blocks. You can very easily open up your map and say, oh, I need to get to the Woodside Apartments and I'm at the corner of Sanders Street and Lindsay Street. If I go down 2 blocks, turn right on Neely Street, left on Cat Street, Woodside Apartments will be on my right. But in F, being stuck in something so tight and twisty as the village portion of Ebisugoku gives the feeling of disorientation or being lost, but every single time you open up the map, it's just, you go forward. That's like it. That's all you do. It's a linear pathway with nothing inhibiting you, apart from an occasional prohibited pathway. It's sort of like the developers took the entirety of the town of the original games and crammed it into like 1/3 of the entire map of F. Now, this isn't necessarily better than the classic game's way of level design or town design, but F fakes its structure in a way that makes it feel more intricate than it is. Silent Hill F also uses a modern trend of item scavenging. Modern games seem to use item scavenging as a way to keep players engaged with the absolute core gameplay loop. Keeping important items such as health and ammo hidden away in every area keeps players focused in moment-to-moment gameplay. While it keeps players engaged in the sense that they're exploring, all it does is sort of mask the fact that the levels are so linear and less expansive. In Silent Hill F, it comes across as a separate system entirely because if you just want to get to the next area, all you have to do is actively not scavenge for anything. If you see a branching pathway, open your map, go the way that looks like it's progress. That's it. Odds are, if you continue the way that your map implies is the correct pathway, then that will likely have very little systemic advantage other than progressing the story. There might be some healing items or offerings along that path, but that other pathway is only there because it will hold some sort of health or ammo. It doesn't lead to anything other than a dead end that you've drained of resources. As a more modern example I could point to, Silent Hill 2 Remake uses this type of item scavenging as well, but in my opinion it's much more egregious in Silent Hill F, simply because the game is so much more linear than that remake was. In Silent Hill 2 Remake, you scavenged while exploring the town itself, as well as the dungeons. And even though Silent Hill 2 Remake funneled its exploration as the game went on, it still felt like you were exploring, finding those hidden pathways or finding those enclosed spaces that held some sort of ammo or healing item. It felt significantly more cohesive, even if in the end it is technically serving the same exact purpose. The illusion is better upheld in not only the older games of the series, but in that remake as well. It leaves incredibly little room for the game to breathe, and only left me with the feeling that the game was a very high-production haunted house, and every single time I opened the map, it was like the lights were turned on, and I could see the molded masks, the plastic dolls, and the fake blood on the walls for what they were. An illusion. And oh my god, let me tell you about Silent Hill F's puzzle box design. You know, when Resident Evil 7 came out, my biggest complaint against the game was that it was tiny. Back then, I wasn't exactly sure how to parse my grievances, but now I know exactly what the issue is, and Silent Hill F does the same exact thing. Both games are geared towards proceeding to the next set piece with as little friction as possible, while still attempting to retain elements of those old puzzle box designs. What that does for the puzzle box element of those games, however, is dwindle them to essentially the bare minimum. The mansion in 7 consisted of only a few rooms in comparison to the Resident Evil 1 remake's dozens, and the backtracking involved in 7, because of that, was mitigated to leisurely strolls at best, only extended out by the instances of Jack or Marguerite Baker. In Silent Hill F, the problem is even more apparent in my opinion due to the fact that there are really only maybe 3 dungeons in the game that are even comparable or at least follow a similar game design structure as the original game's dungeons. These dungeons are obviously very rare and appear only in the classic sense one time in the Fog World, and the rest are in the Other World. In the Fog World, you get the middle school, and aesthetically, it is the most true to form compared to the original games. While it is, again, disappointingly tiny, it requires a few instances of backtracking, good enemy placement, and even offers a genuinely fantastic real puzzle of trying to decode a cryptic schoolgirl language involving numbers and letters. Now, if you ask me, the best Otherworld dungeon is the one near the very end of the game where you traverse your own house. And that's really because it's the only one in the entire game that actually feels like it was taken out of an earlier entry in the series. Whereas the entire game seems to be almost scared of making the player traverse that much, your Otherworld house is the only one that makes you traverse several floors, having to traverse between all of them at least twice in order to finish solving the overall goal of this dungeon, which is gathering these emblems to solve the one last puzzle before pressing onward. The school has a total of 2 instances of backtracking. One where you get the key in the yard and have to come back to use it on the 2nd floor, and the overarching puzzle of solving the riddles left by school children that you slowly acquire as the dungeon progresses. And it was playing through this dungeon in particular that made me kind of realize something. Silent Hill F itself seems to be scared of one thing: making the player think about what to do next. There is an egregious bombardment of in-game notifications constantly telling you what to do and where to go. There is an embarrassing amount of moments in the game where you discover an item only to use it 3 seconds later. And most of the game is guiding you down, like I said previously, a pretty linear pathway. You could make the argument that that shortens the artificial lengthening of the game, but to me it just feels like hand-holding in a genre that is kind of built around player disempowerment, and that includes the muddled information that the game gives you. But an example of even just a normal puzzle that feels hand-holdy, the puzzle box room in the Otherworld, where you have to reach Sakuko and emerge Rinko into the lava, is one of the most annoying instances of the game feeling like a marionette in this department of design. At face value, sure, the elements are there. The entire section of the game is a literal puzzle box where you have to flip switches that will lock and unlock certain doors to reach areas of the level in order to progress. But if you play through the level and literally flip every switch you come across as you see it, except for this one, which is optional, you'll literally just walk a straight line through the puzzle. You see switch, you flip switch, and you move forward. There's no puzzle here. Just like Resident Evil 7 and Village, but more egregious in Village, these feel obligated to be there and are generally tossed aside the second the developers feel like they might be keeping the player held up for too long. The most frustrating thing about this is that F makes it clear that the team could make those more engaging, more interesting, more difficult if they wanted to. I can't fault them for leaning away from some of the established tropes of the series, but it comes across as frustrating to me that things I love about these games are dangled above me like a carrot on a string, tantalizing me but never giving me the full satisfaction that I want out of it. The one caveat here, though, is that the actual riddles are very good. I played this game on 3 different riddle difficulties. My first was hard, second was into the fog, third was easy. And even some of the easy puzzles kind of stump me now and again. At the risk of potentially sounding like a hypocrite or an idiot, I will say that some of the puzzles in Into the Fog are too vague in their wording, and they leave a lot to interpretation, which could lead to several hours potentially of you misunderstanding something that needs to be reinterpreted. My biggest concern at this point is that Silent Hill feels more like a Resident Evil game than it ever has before. While I still think that the combat system is fantastic and genuinely something that other horror games should take notes of, by the end of F, the combat is front and center, completely disregarding nearly every other element of the game entirely for this sense of power. And no, I'm not strictly talking about the Fox Arm combat that you have in the Otherworld segments. I like that system, despite its strange inclusion in a survival horror game, let alone a Silent Hill game. But I'm strictly speaking of the gauntlets upon gauntlets of unavoidable combat scenarios that at some point will start testing your patience. Sure, at some point, the boss fights are exciting and thrilling, but never, and I mean never, should I be playing a Silent Hill game and think, I feel like a badass, or, most egregiously, this shit goes hard. But that happened, like, multiple times. It's lame. Heather in Silent Hill 3 is a badass simply on the merit that she managed to kill God. But at no point throughout the entirety of Silent Hill 3 do you feel like she has some superpower or some otherworldly ability to kill God. You literally just end up in an arena with a gun, and by sheer luck, you come out victorious. Silent Hill F throws out the idea of player disempowerment entirely in the Dark Shrine areas by the midway point of the game, and instead gives you the supernaturally equivalent of a Resident Evil power fantasy. It's weird. It doesn't even make an attempt at being scary, and worst of all, and I hate saying this, it doesn't feel like a Silent Hill game. The other main thing that I really wanted to talk about in terms of disappointments that F brought me is something very specific. I talked quite in depth about this in my video on the Silent Hill 2 remake, and it's related to the story, but only tangentially so. At least, in that game's case. But what I'm talking about here is the notes and symbolism within Silent Hill F do what I feared the Silent Hill 2 remake would do, which is constantly, blatantly refer to things within the narrative. Whether it's using named letters to or from Hinako herself, her friends, or things that are a literal representation of what they mean. The worst part about this is that if the game simply considered leaving names out of these memos or not have Hinako herself constantly telling the player what these things are referring to, such as having to point out that Sakuko loved rabbits when Hinako walks into a room filled with empty rabbit cages, or that Rinko collected dolls in the same room that you find notes called Rinko's Diary, where she vents about her frustrations about her feelings towards Shu. All of this stuff would not have irritated me. It would have been basically exactly what I wanted. All of this stuff would have still felt ambiguous, cryptic, and still incredibly Silent Hill. While there are still plenty of aspects of the game's narrative that are exactly what you expect a narrative of a Silent Hill game to be, it feels almost condescending how outright blatant some of the game's symbolism is, because it literally refuses to keep a lot of it ambiguous. At around roughly the midway point of the game, you essentially have to kill your 3 friends in the Otherworld, and each time you enter a room, Hinako will outright say this. It feels... I can't believe I'm saying this. It feels lazy. The most egregious and insulting example of this is when Hinako's father literally turns into the big disgusting blob monster that you've encountered several times before in the game. Wow, thanks game. Wish I could have maybe used the symbolism that you spent the entire time building up to this moment, maybe to understand and make the connection myself, but I guess you'll just tell me outright. And I want to stop here and just remind you that I'm not saying that these things make the game bad, nor am I demanding the game to be more like Silent Hill 2. Because not only does the narrative of F feel like the first game since the original 4 to not try to be Silent Hill 2, but it takes the anthological narrative that Silent Hill 2 really leaned into and does something new and striking with it. The blatant and overt symbolism is only a part of the game that irritates me, because the game's story, like I said, has plenty here to unpack, and even with each ending alluding to something entirely different every time. I don't doubt that Silent Hill F will have something to chew on for at least a while. In the regard of the actual narrative itself, there is plenty here to love, as it does focus on gender inequality of the time period and the culture of Japan, leaning heavily into some disturbing aspects of trauma, assault, and what is expected of a woman at the time, regardless of her opinion, her belief, or her own desires. I feel no hesitation whatsoever in saying that I don't think that there is a character in any Silent Hill game who has suffered as much as Hinako has. At least not in terms of her actual experience within the power of Silent Hill itself. She is fraught with the death of people close to her, an overlapping timeline of the abuse of power and forced love and the physical abuse of a ritual. While I'm not a teenage girl in Japan, and never will be one, there was still plenty of this game's narrative that did speak to me at least to some extent, and I think that is what makes the game most disturbing of all, even with all of its physical and psychological mutilation. But the thing that really annoys me through all of this is that Silent Hill started out as a game that was supposed to be a Resident Evil clone, but the team making the game were eventually given the unprecedented freedom to make basically whatever they wanted, and what they made is something that has influenced not only horror games, but the horror genre entirely. I think that Silent Hill is secretly the most influential piece of horror media since Alien in the 70s. What F is now is Silent Hill trying to be Resident Evil. Mechanically, it feels almost exactly what I think that Konami would mandate that first Silent Hill game to be if Resident Evil came out last year. It's not bad, necessarily, but with so many people trashing the 360 era of Silent Hill games, saying the series had lost its identity, I've never felt more that if the franchise continues down the pathway that F has laid out, that identity will be lost more than ever. F is not a bad game, but I have to ask, what even is a Silent Hill game at this point? Now, you may or may not have noticed that I left out something in those pillars of what makes a survival horror game. Sure, the puzzle box matters, the player disempowerment matters equally as much, and the horror really is there just to tie it all together. But there is something else. A fourth pillar firmly planting the structure into the recesses of the minds of the people who love these games. And if you ask me, it's just as important as all the other ones. The hidden aspect of what really makes a good survival horror game is simply atmosphere. Ask any die-hard survival horror fan what their favorite parts of the game are, and I can guarantee you that somewhere, very high on that list, will be them saying something to the effect that the games are cozy in their own nightmarish sort of way. It's what helped me latch on to Silent Hill 2 way back when I played it. And it's part of that overwhelming cascade of influence that I alluded to earlier regarding Silent Hill's influence on horror in general. People love to bathe in the foggy streets of Silent Hill and be in that town. And Silent Hill F, for all of the faults that I've laid upon it in the previous chapter, for the most part, gets this aspect of the series down nearly perfectly. There are so many points during F's runtime where I just sat and stewed in the world, from the foggy hillside after leaving the school to the town of Ebisugoka itself. The field of disturbingly shifting scarecrows down to some of the darkness-drenched otherworld locations. Silent Hill has always meant two things to me. Horror, whether it's overt or subtle or psychological, and comfort. The serene, quiet, moody nature of the fog-drenched streets of that American town where you can feel the isolation of simply being alone somewhere where people should exist, and you feel the cold wind rushing against your skin. And it wasn't until the pretty much mandatory second playthrough of Silent Hill F that I really appreciated this game's atmosphere, and part of that is the addition of needing to find certain enemies to give certain shrines that will eventually unlock a new weapon that will in turn unlock a new ending. Finding the clues in new areas and familiar ones alike, and having to dig and scour some of the game's locations with an overarching goal finally allowed the game to breathe in a way that I don't think it had time to do so before. For the first time since basically the start of the original playthrough, I allowed myself to bathe in this game's atmosphere because I wasn't feeling pushed in any single direction. I knew where the game was going to lead me, and having the time set aside looking for these new items was exactly what F needed to make it feel more like what I expected F to always feel like. Sure, the game was still leading me down a narrow pathway with other paths that existed solely to have an item at the end of it. Sure, the combat was just as much at the forefront in the back half of the game, and sure, the game loved to tell me who left what note where, and Hinako damn well made sure to let me know how she felt about it. But having the objective of an overarching scavenging hunt gave way for a valid reason to be going down all of these pathways. It gave the game a reason to explore as much as possible, and it gave the game a reason to let me finally soak in its vibes. Aspects of the story changed, whether subtle or shockingly apparent, which made my attention towards the narrative hyper-focused. And it was during this second playthrough that I finally began to understand better what F was doing. Literally, right from the beginning, there were new things to see, new cutscenes to experience, and new locations to explore. There were new notes even, with one in particular about a non-believer in the power of the town becoming literally filled from the inside with maggots, being so intrinsically disturbing that I had a visceral reaction to it, and I had to pause the game and get up and get a glass of water. Notes like this were still very rare and uncommon, but they were exactly what I wanted the notes in the game to always have been. There's no specific connection to who is writing this letter. There's no specific connection to who it is relative to Hinako or the game itself, but it is connected thematically to the game's narrative. It is always what I wanted this game's notes to look like. With this second playthrough came a better understanding of the game's narrative, more cohesive cutscenes, and some genuinely surprising twists on my expectations, and I realized that the second playthrough of the game wasn't just recommended or even basically mandatory, but the first playthrough is essentially an incredibly long preamble for this new game plus. And I have to tell you that the idea of a game like Silent Hill having subtle and obvious tweaks to the game's narrative, mechanics, and items between playthroughs is such a perfectly Silent Hill thing to do. Not only does it inherently give the game replay value, but it will constantly make you ask yourself, is that new? Was that in the original playthrough? Or even something to the effect of, I know this is different, but what about it is? A Silent Hill game that makes me ask myself these questions is perfect. It makes me feel like I'm actually losing my mind as I watch a cutscene with only a few lines changed. I found myself constantly doubting my own memory as to what actually was different in the first place. It is such a fantastic psychological trick that actively fucks with you, but also keeps you engaged with the game's narrative in a way that the first playthrough simply could never hope to accomplish. That psychological warfare against the player is not only something that feels like a new attempt for the series, but feels so appropriate for everything the franchise has ever stood up for until this point. Whether it's intentional or not, the New Game Plus experience of Silent Hill F is, in my opinion, the most aggressive experience against the player that the series has ever managed to pull off. And I think even more than Silent Hill's cohesive atmosphere coming to this new game, I think Silent Hill F's biggest accomplishment is this new game plus. Like I said before, the things that I didn't like about the game are still there. But when it comes to you expecting the same, even coming down to notes and messages that you uncover, and you realize that Hinako says something different, or the notes themselves are completely different, my frustrations still held ground, but they were ever so slowly being sanded away. While not everything in New Game Plus is different, there is a constant stream of new content that perks your ears up every single time you find it. You obsess over all of those new little details. You scour the game again with newfound purpose. You have a new context for basically everything the game is presenting to you. And I felt like I was finally seeing Silent Hill F for what it is. And for the first time, I felt like I had an answer to the question, what even is a Silent Hill game anyway? Look, I'm gonna be honest here. For as much as Silent Hill F sincerely did impress me on that second playthrough, the third playthrough, which is required in order to achieve the true ending, knocked the game back down a peg for me. And again, I want to reiterate, it's not like I think the game is bad. I want to reassure you that I still enjoyed my time with Silent Hill F. I don't think that I would have bothered beating it 3 fucking times in order to achieve the true ending if I really thought the game was, like, actually bad. But whereas the first run subverted expectations that I had on the series itself, and New Game Plus subverted my expectations on the game itself, New Game Plus Plus was just mildly frustrating. Maybe more than that. And it comes down to the fact that New Game Plus was consistently throwing new things at me. From nearly frame 1, there was at least something to make me tilt my head and ask myself, wait, was that new? New Game Plus Plus, however, is substantially just New Game Plus again, which made the entire third run of the game more tedious than it ever had been before. There were so many cutscenes that I had to rewatch, so many encounters that I had to fight through, and so many fucking notes that remained unchanged. Now that isn't to say that it was literally the same. There were still new things to see in New Game Plus Plus, but what felt at least like 60% of the game was new content in New Game Plus, New Game Plus Plus in comparison felt like at most 15 to 20%. And having to play the entirety of Silent Hill F for a third time for what felt like table scraps of new content was just, I don't want to say boring, but it sure as hell wasn't fun. The thing about the New Game Plus run was the items that you were looking for to achieve those new endings were not only relatively easy to find, I mean, you could find pictures that gave you a clue as to where you could find them. But even if you didn't find all the pieces, you would still get a new ending. The most frustrating thing about all that is, in order to acquire the final ending, you cannot miss a very important item that is pretty missable if you don't know what it is you're even looking for. Imagine playing through the game for a third time, looking for this thing, and you get the same ending that you got for New Game Plus. I can't ever imagine wanting to play the game again just to hopefully find the item that you missed in order to get the final real ending. And I'll be honest, I'll be straightforward with you. I looked online to make sure I didn't miss it, because if I had gotten that same ending, my review of this game, this video, would have been significantly more negative, but I wanted the context of that final ending to relay back to you. But even disregarding that, forcing players to play through the game for a third time with so little that is different is a brutal ask for a lot of people. especially those like me who weren't immediately enamored with the game. But I imagine even those who were would find a third run through to be pretty tedious to at least some extent. You have no idea how badly I want Silent Hill to thrive again, and I hate coming across so negatively towards this game because it does a lot right. Hinako and her plight is an effective narrative told in a relatively very effective manner, but so many of these little things, whether they were narrative related or mechanically so, left me feeling hollow about the game in general. And it's because of this that I now have to reconcile with the fact that Silent Hill is officially back now. And even a year out from Silent Hill 2 Remake's release, that is still weird to admit. But now with the release of F, the first new game in the series since 2012, it is really here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. For as much as I have downplayed so many aspects of the game up until now, New Game Plus made me realize that yes, at its core, Silent Hill F is indeed a Silent Hill game. And that's not a question I felt like I need to ask myself or answer to anybody. But I do worry that the systems and things that I loved about the series might strictly be delegated to the remakes instead of a brand new entry. But now I'm at the end of the video. I've beaten the game 3 times, and I think I finally have an answer to my question. What even is a Silent Hill game at this point? Silent Hill can rework its combat, it can change its characters, it can fiddle with the systems, and it can even change the town itself. But what matters is the evil of that town and the way it is presented to you. Whether that town is Silent Hill itself or Ebisugoka, the evil that we all know as Silent Hill, in the end, is really what matters. And Ebisugoka, along with the evil in that town, after 3 full playthroughs, will be left to silence. And I think I'm okay with that.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.